the Director of Community Management for REAMP. And you guys know about REAMP after hearing it from Gail. She served the network for over a decade, and her role is to foster the health of the network by supporting the connection and collaboration of the members. So Sarah's a true weaver, a system weaver. The motto of REAMP is to think systemically and act collaboratively, which has a real ring to it, doesn't it? Make a good t-shirt. But I really love that. You know, it's collaborative work with the idea of fostering systems change, which lies at the heart of what we're doing this semester in this class. So this idea, this motto, has inspired a way to pioneer new ways for the network to see and understand and take wise action. And specifically through the development of a social systems map, which is somewhat analogous to the work we're doing. And maybe Sarah can share with us how this map has informed the work of the network over time and how it is kind of a living document. So I think that's a real important piece for us, is all this work we're doing in our frameworks, how does this inform organizational action? I think Sarah can share with us some background, some insights around that. So let's see. So Sarah and I have known each other for a couple of years now. We met in the context of this series of dialogues we did with these systems weavers, and we also spent some time in Santiago. And I shared with you some insights about, you know, the surprise associated with the revolution that occurred in the streets. Sarah, how did you first realize that there was something weird going on when we were down there in Santiago?
I think my first hint of that was when we were going to the conferences, and as we were like walking to the university and stuff, you know, we saw a lot of people protesting, much, you know, to what I've seen down in Madison and stuff. You know, people wearing the same shirts, everybody's chanting, but we did see that escalate over the week. And by the very last day, myself and Curtis Ogden, who I think you've heard speak as well, or is going to.
The last one.
Yeah, okay. So we were on our way to the Human Rights Museum, as a matter of fact, and, you know, we were in a good part of town. It was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all of a sudden there are police in riot gear, you know, with tanks, with water cannons just coming down the street, just blasting everybody. And I ended up leaving town that day. So Bruce is much more familiar with the escalation past that, but you know, it was very interesting to go from like a very peaceful protest situation, you know, took a little longer to walk someplace, but no big deal, to holy cow, we almost got hit with a water cannon walking to a museum.
Ironically, the museum dedicated to memorializing the dictator's oppression of the people, which it was closed, right? You didn't even get to see the museum.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The plebiscite, which was delayed because of COVID, is this month. They're actually going to vote on whether they're going to proceed with the constitutional reform, which I think is really exciting. You know, it says as an outcome, a really progressive outcome from that event. So we'll keep our eyes on that, eh? So Sarah, I'd like to start with you with a question about REAMP, about the systems change challenge REAMP is intended to address. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a broad overview, and I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the, you know, the reasoning behind a network approach, a little bit of the history, like what kind of got us started and launched. And, you know, as Bruce was mentioning, some of this systems analysis work that we do, both in terms of our shared systems analysis as well as that social systems mapping work that he had mentioned too. So, you know, as Bruce said, I'm Director of Community Management for the REAMP Network. I'm based out in rural western Wisconsin, and I'm going on 12 years with the network. Most of my time I spent working with a small segment of members who did direct greenhouse gas regulation work. So we did a lot of work around the Clean Power Plan, for example. And in 2016, I came on board in the role that I have today. So what's kind of cool about my perspective in terms of networks is because I've been with a network for so long, and a very transformative network, you know, I really have lived firsthand experience about some of the transformations that we've made along the way. It's been a really interesting personal journey, because just as the network has sort of evolved and adapted and grown over time, I can see some of those same changes mirrored within myself. I do attribute a lot of my own personal growth and development to, a direct result to my involvement in this network in particular. So yeah, so the question here about REAMP, maybe a little bit here. So, first and foremost, we were founded by Garfield Foundation, and they are very interested in taking a network approach to complex problems. And if you've ever read the book Connecting to Change the World by Pete Plastrick, if you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. And in there, he talks about these complex, wicked problems. These are dynamic problems. They last a long time. And as you come to understand more about such a problem, you really have to adapt your own approach to solving it. And so when you think about a problem like climate change, it's definitely a wicked complex problem. It's everything from the food that we eat to how we get around our communities and everything in between, right? It's a system with multiple forces, many interdependencies that are all contributing to this. And what that means is that there's no single root cause, and there's no silver bullet solution. So through a network, so what we really need is we need a structure that allows us to be nimble, that allows us to be adaptable, and that allows us to be inclusive. And that's what a network structure does. It allows us to be nimble, adaptable, and inclusive. And that's exactly what we do in REAMP. We bring together diverse groups of people, from funders, advocates, people in the Midwest climate movement, and we're bringing people together so they can develop a shared understanding together, so they can act together, and so that they can learn together. And we believe that's the pathway towards impactful change. So a little bit of context here about REAMP then. So we were founded in 2004 by Garfield Foundation. Garfield was interested again in working on this complex problem. They had two hypotheses that they wanted to test. They thought in order to make impactful change, first and foremost, we had to take a systems thinking approach to this problem because it's too complex to understand otherwise. And two, we really had to strengthen the collaboration between groups working to address climate. And to the best of our ability, start to break down hierarchical relationships that have existed between advocates and funders. So they did end up testing this network experiment in the Midwest for 3 reasons. Again, they're focused on climate. So number one, here in the Midwest, we are contributing more than our fair share of pollution into the atmosphere. A lot of industry, manufacturing, coal, oil, gas development, all that happens here. They also found as they talked to advocates and funders, people were hungry for a new approach. They were tired of doing the same old thing. And then third, we have a political opportunity here. If we can win here in the Midwest, we can more easily win in other parts of the country. So that was sort of the context setting. So again, it's like 2004, the first 20 network members come together. And these folks set out on a year-long systems mapping process. And for many of them, it was their first experience doing something like this. They charted, what was causing emissions to rise, what would cause emissions to fall, what is sort of the perspectives and expertise in the room, and trying to get all of that out on paper in front of each other and trying to figure out how all these things fit together. I heard it was brutal. I heard it was really hard, and it took them a whole year. But this idea of thinking systemically was so foundational to our network for so many reasons. First and foremost is it really started to identify some of these key levers for members to start organizing around. And that was actually really important because for some people walking into that room in 2004, the notion was we really needed to focus on building out clean energy. If we can build out the clean energy system, it's going to make those products cheaper. As they become cheaper, markets are going to shift in favor of them. As the markets shift, we're going to be able to get all the other solutions we want to see enacted. But by the time they were done with this mapping process, people stepped back and they said, holy shit, it's just as important that we don't let a new coal plant get built in this region as it is that we continue to build out the clean energy system. So again, it really gave this realization of, there are key levers in the system. It's important for us to be addressing all of them at the same time. And that's part of the pathway towards systemic change. This mapping process also gave birth to our original forms of collaboration. Members started to organize around some of these key nodes, It gave birth to our network's name. While REAMP doesn't stand for anything today, in 2004, it was the Renewable Energy Alignment Mapping Project. And our logo, which you may or may not have seen, is actually a derivative of our original systems map. We have two green arrows driving up. That represents increasing energy efficiency and increasing renewable energy. There are two black arrows driving down. That represents shutting down the dirty coal plants and stopping the build out of new coal plants. And then we have a bullseye in the center, because the final thing that this mapping process did was it got people in the room to agree to our very first North Star goal, which was to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the Midwest by 2050, economy-wide. And all of that happened because of a systems thinking approach. So yeah, especially for us, as Bruce said, our motto is to think systemically and act collaboratively. And that is really woven through the fabric of everything that we do. So, as Bruce mentioned, we have a social systems map. It's a way for us to think systemically about our own network by looking at information about people and their relationship to one another. We hold a collaboratively created shared systems analysis, which we refer to as the Equitable Deep Decarbonization Framework, which provides a platform for members to guide their thinking and work as we move to equitably eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in the Midwest. And I think maybe I should just stop there, because I think some of these other comments might be more useful a little bit later. So I'll stop right there for now.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. I love the overall context, and also love the reinforcement that this systems mapping process was difficult, arduous, intense, and took a year, because I want everyone in class to sort of take a breath about their work. It is a time-consuming process and difficult. And part of the difficulty, I suppose, is having different stakeholders in the room with different perspectives of what the system is, let alone what the objectives could be, and kind of articulating and then putting all those different assumptions into one shared system map. That sounds like a bear. Is this map something that is kind of a living resource for the network at this point?
Oh, that's a great question, Bruce. It's actually, our analysis today is not the same analysis of 2004. Our analysis today is a reflection of the evolution and adaptation of our network over time. So our first analysis, as I just described, we spent a year putting that together, but it was a static map. So it was there, it was useful for a time, but the problem was that we didn't have a good way of updating it, of reflecting the actions our members had taken, the changes in the world around us, the things we've come to learn and understand that we didn't know then. So around 2016, 2015, our network, decided to evolve and adapt our analysis, which I had referred to as the Equitable Deep Decarbonization Framework. So unlike our first analysis, this is a living analysis. It's never going to be completed. But what it does, again, is it provides this platform for members to think about the work that they're doing. And it really creates this virtuous relationship between analysis, action, and learning. And that learning, that is really the key step, I think, in terms of thinking about social change or transformation, however you want to describe it. It's the learning that really propels us and moves us forward.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about that change. Like how would the two arrows, the arrows going up, the arrows going down, is the understanding of what needs to be changed in the system shifted over time?
Oh, absolutely, Bruce. Absolutely. I think the biggest shift in our network has been about centering people into our work. Our first North Star goal in 2004, like I said, was an 80% reduction in the economy-wide by 2050. Our North Star goal today is to equitably eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in the Midwest by 2050. And that shift in our thinking, I think, has really shifted a lot of things in our network. And I can remember exactly the time when, right around this tipping point that we're like, we can feel that there's some tension in our network. We were a network that has cared about equity since our inception. We haven't always done it well. We've always struggled to kind of like figure out, what is our role in this? How do we fit equity into our work? And around that 2015, 2016 time, it was Gail Francis, actually, who led us through this exercise. And she said, you know what, I just want to try something here. So I want you all to think about our North Star goal, 80% reduction by 2050. And I want you to write down everything that comes to mind in terms of what we need to do to get there. Okay, we took 2 minutes, did that. Cool. Okay, now I want you to do the same exercise with the idea of equitably eliminating greenhouse gas emissions in the Midwest by 2050. And lo and behold, what a shift in the mindsets. Instead of talking about policies and technologies and storage, people were talking about health and people's well-being and how folks are going to get around. So it was a really dynamic shift for our network, really kind of triggered by something that seems so simple yet so powerful. And I think mindfulness is one of those things that's, underlying in a network culture that is so important to pay attention to. It's also hard to pay attention to, but that's because it's expressed in so many other ways in how you're doing the work. So to carry on with that story, so we've been talking about this new framework, right? The Equitable Deep Decarbonization Framework. And when we first started launching this analysis, we took some work from the U.S. Deep Decarbonization Pathways Report. We had done some environmental justice assessments from our own network. We took, we gathered up members to do research and analysis, and we put together this framework. And we came up with some benchmarks. What are some of the targets that we need to hit in the short term if we're going to meet our goals long term? And again, everything's always changing in a network, just like the world around us changes, just like these complex, wicked problems change and adapt. And we did an equity analysis about a year ago. And a recommendation from that equity analysis said, hey, you should throw out these benchmarks, because these benchmarks, like your original North Star goal, don't center people in it. They don't center the well-being of the population of humans in this work. And instead of having these hard targets, what you should really create is some guiding principles for how you're going to be approaching this work. I think the other thing that has also come from this particular analysis, which as I talk about this framework, I'm really thinking about the world around us, the outworld world around us, is that in terms of, so we have the guiding principles, and that also, it helps us guide our work, but the framework also starts to show us our blind spots. We start to see the things that we don't actually know and that we need to take the time to figure out. So an example might be, hey, so we can see very clearly through research, analysis, whatever, that we can hit 90% renewable energy in a really equitable and just way. But as we're looking at this, we can see that this 10%, we don't know how we're going to get across the finish line there. And so that's actually a really important purpose of this framework too, is to sort of highlight these blind spots that we know we need to start thinking about now. Because, if we continued as business as usual, we're going to hit that point, and then what? It's probably going to be too late at that point. So yeah, that's something else that framework has provided as a very important function for our network.
I see a really interesting question in chat from Mike about, seeing these tensions that develop in the network as a positive sign or a hidden opportunity. As the Director of Community Management, is that kind of part of your role to sort of check in with the members and sort of kind of see the sort of tensions or differences as opportunities to kind of change the direction of the network?
Absolutely. It's kind of a funny thing, because this is something where I feel like I've really grown personally as the network has grown to recognize this too. Because especially in the early days, as you're first coming around, you're really gathering around similarity. Right? It's easy, it's easy to find the sweet spots. It's easy to work together. And so that's what we want to do. And even for myself, in terms of like facilitating a group, for example, that's the direction that I had really liked to go. Like, let's find what's similar between us, hold us together so we can move forward. But as Mike said, it's the difference that actually creates innovation. And innovation is what we're really looking for in the network, right? That's what causes us to evolve. That's what causes us to get better. So I think our network has done a much better job of feeling, when we feel those tensions, when we start to sense that, there is tension in our network, to not like try and cover it up or not worry about it, but really dig into it. Because oftentimes we find something really interesting and inspiring there. I can say one of my practices as a community manager. So I mentioned we have this social systems map, which is a way of us thinking systemically about ourselves as a network. And one of the practices we have is, in that map, we can see how people are living in the network. As people become more connected to the network, the more centrally located they become. So in terms of looking at our map, I actually spend very little time looking at who's in the middle of the hairball. I'm looking at who's on the edge, who isn't as well connected, why aren't they well connected, what is the work that they're doing, how is it same or different than what the core is doing, and what might we do to tap into their energy, to their different ways of thinking and energy, to really, again, develop, help improve our shared understanding, help us think about new ways of doing things, and continue to work on this path towards transformation.
Yeah, that's great. I'm tempted to jump into a theme that has to do with the specific paper that these folks read about sort of the evolution of a network and how it evolves over time, or grows or matures. Does it have a life cycle, that kind of thing? How would you describe that? Those changes over the time that you've been there, which is most of the network, in response to those tensions, so the network has a different purpose or a different orientation toward equity and an equitable transition. Has the network structure or its composition shifted as well over time?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll say before I give some examples is what I have observed about our network is that the amount of tension it takes to create change it doesn't need to be as great as it was in the past. So in the past, because we're still like figuring these things out, and we were very locked into our structure. Again, we had this static analysis, which was important. I don't want to undersell how important that was, but it was static. So things started to feel stagnated in our network. Some of our members, and I would say especially our youth members, they were the ones to recognize it first and really start building the tension in the network. Hey, we need to make some shifts. Hey, we need to really think about, the ways that we're doing things. And I would say our structure prior to, this is 2014-ish time, was very locked. It was very siloed. Every time we kind of had a new piece of work that we wanted to focus on, whether it was, working with a specific group of people or working in a new issue area like transportation, we created structures that were, again, very siloed. And what we've recognized over time is that what we really need to do is to create forms of collaboration that really bring all of those together, that really help the folks who are working on energy efficiency know what's happening with folks who are, working in the power sector. And there are some shared work that could happen or collaborations that could happen. And again, I think because we had this more static, rigid view and structure and platform, it was a lot harder for us to make change than what it takes today. I think the network today is far more responsive to members than it was, back in 2008. And I think a lot of that is also because of, our growth in terms of understanding systems, understanding networks, really coming into our own about what a core network thinking concept looks like. And I think as a result of that, we are much more fluid, much more adaptable, and much better able to serve our members and their work than we were in the past. So some of the things that have changed for us is our forms of collaboration. We've had working groups, we've had caucuses, we have task force, we've had hubs, we've had state tables, we've had action teams. All of these have been evolutions of ways that we're trying to bring people together to collaborate over time. One of the big tensions that has been longstanding in our network is, are we a funder or are we a network? because our network does serve as an intermediary. So we do re-grant money for members to do the work that needs to happen, in addition to supporting relationships, network building, people coming together, doing their best thinking and planning on all of that. So we've had this long-standing tension between, you know, are people coming to the network because of the money, or are they coming because they want to collaborate? And that's been something that's actually been tough for us to navigate and figure out. But I think over time, something that I have observed in our own network is more and more and more people are coming to our network because of the work, because of the people. They aren't really coming because of the money. And I think that's a reflection of our evolution in terms of our culture from within. So we've changed the way that we collaborate. One of the other big changes that we made too, which was about 2014, is prior to 2014, we did not have anybody in charge. So we had this network with like 100 organizations and however many people, and we had a board, you know, made up of folks that were elected. But unless the board had full agreement, we just kind of got stagnated. We couldn't really move forward unless people felt like there was total agreement to do so. And it was actually really hard for us to evolve and change and adapt because, you know, we didn't have a holder of the whole. And so around 2014, we hired our first chief network officer. And so that has been a very important function. Well, I would say our chief network officer doesn't have, you know, absolute authority. We still have a board that is elected. They are still responsible for helping set the strategic direction of the network. But now we do have this chief network officer who helps support us as staff, you know, who's working with the steering committee, really acting as that holder of the whole, which I think has been really important for our network.
Yeah.
Some of the other things that we've done then too is we've like evolved our purpose. So like we've evolved our structure, you know, we've evolved our analysis. We've also evolved our purpose. So I mentioned, you know, we have that North Star goal change. Something else that we've done too is we've really focused on clarifying our mission, vision, and values. And while that doesn't sound very exciting, that's actually really important, because if you are in a state of constant flux, which I might argue a network always is, if you don't have these values, you know, this core mission and values to fall back on to help guide the choices and the direction that you're making, you're just making so much more work for yourself. It is so much easier for us to kind of fall back on those values to use when times get tough. And that has actually been a very important evolution for our network too.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Tara, I want to take it down a scale because I'm curious about what did the practice of a systems weaver, you know, in your everyday activities, you know, if a astrobiologist from another planet stuck a radio collar on you and, you know, and kind of tracked you in your everyday moves, what does that look like? What's a sort of day in the life or a typical day of a systems weaver?
So have you ever seen a picture of like that person who's like, you know, trying to balance like plates on their hands and on their heads and on their bellies and on their feet? That's pretty much what being a network weaver is like. That's the best picture I could give you. You're usually juggling a lot of things at once. So when I got this job, I didn't know what a network weaver was. I had no idea. I honestly didn't ever hear that term until, you know, probably till like 2016 or something. But I did come to this work as an organizer. And I think there's a lot of the same skills and thinking that organizers have that really lend themselves well to a network weaver, because it's really about helping people be their best selves. That's my job in the network, is to help other people. And so one of the things that I really like to, I have these like simple rules that I have developed for myself, and I've heard from some of our other staff that, you know, we use all the time. So some of those would be like, you never do anything alone. So if I'm doing something for the network, I have got to reach out and work with somebody else, a member ideally in the network, because, you know, it's about bringing people in to help do the work. More importantly, it also creates a culture and an expectation with the members that like they have to take care of the network themselves too. It's not just us as staff who's responsible for taking care of this network. The responsibility is on them just as much. So we never do anything alone. Another simple rule we have is to never let perfect be the enemy of good. Because we're always adapting, because we're always evolving, it's okay to not be perfect. You can be imperfectly perfect. So, you know, just embracing that and being okay with that. some other things sort of like in the day in life of myself, I spend a lot of time just working with members. So, as we see things in an evaluation or in a survey that might be interesting, like reaching out and following up with people, inviting members to like step into spaces, and using that social systems map really helps me do that. And in terms of network building, I use that map too, like I said, to find those people who are at the edge and find a reason to bring them into the core. Because, we got to get people to fly to the center, get that experience in REAMP, get a deeper understanding, build themselves, and then fly back out to the edges and carry that experience, that work, that thinking, that mindfulness with them in the world around them as well. So I do a variety of things, honestly. I do membership services work. I do orientations. I manage our online collaborative platform. I help with newsletters. I help members tell their stories. I help plan our annual meetings. So I do meeting planning, agenda planning, meeting facilitation. It's always a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I see Delaney has a question about titles. This is such a diverse range of activities. Is Network Weaver something you embrace?
I embrace it, but I don't think I would adopt that as a title within my own network. Because members in my network, they're network weavers too. I'm not the only weaver. Gail is a weaver in our network too. But, director of community management, that says a little bit more like about what members are going to be expecting from me. I think in terms of the world at large, or maybe for the purposes of this, I'm more than happy to accept the title of network weaver.
Yeah. Over time, have you noticed a kind of a shift in people's eagerness to be involved, their commitment? Sometimes people join with great enthusiasm, but over years, their enthusiasm might slip, or they might feel like they've gotten what they can out of it, and they might slip away. And then there's the question of how, whether and how to bring in new members. What does that look like? That sort of, how do you manage a network to keep its energy level where you need it to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, we've had a lot of growing pains around this, especially when we made the shift to really focus on centering equity into all of our work. And we made, around that same time, we made some dramatic shifts in the ways that we supported collaboration in our network. And what that meant is that, some people who were in charge and who had power no longer had that. And, this feeling of loss for them, and this feeling of excitement for the folks who are coming on board, or, that was sort of the direction that they wanted to see happen. What's been really interesting for our network, I think most recently, is, we do new member interviews. So people who are interested in becoming members, I sit down with them for an interview, and I always ask them, why did you want to be a part of this network? And in the past, I think more of the responses were about, oh, well, I wanted to work with this group on this issue, or, hey, like I was involved in a campaign and I heard that we might be able to get some money from REAMP, for a member. And the reason that I hear people coming to us today is the fact that we are centering equity. They're like, look, we care about climate justice, not just climate change. And we know that's part of your core mission. We hear it from your members all the time, and we want to be part of the group as well. When we bring members together, we apply a lot of when we bring members together in a group to do some collective strategy setting, we often use systems tools or methods or models to help them really think systemically about the challenge that we're facing. So, we're going to work on something about thinking about clean energy as a human right, for example. And, we have really hard, heavy conversations. And at the same time, we are also bringing humanity and love and fun into the room. And our members get an experience in REAMP that they do not get anywhere else. And they'll often say something to the effect of, wow, that was a really incredible meeting. I am exhausted. My brain hurts right now. Like, this was all so hard. And at the same time, like, I have more love in my heart now than I could ever imagine. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this group. So it's really been a dramatic shift because, again, it's not a transactional relationship where I think Early in our days, it was more transactional, but, we're here, 17 years later. We've built a strong foundation of relationships, which is so important for this work. We have this very audacious North Star goal that really galvanizes people and gets them jazzed. And then the experience that they get when they show up, it really translates across boundaries. Members in our network, we don't have a social media account or anything like that, but our members, they connect with each other on social media. I can even speak for myself. If I make a post, I bet half of the people who comment or like it are people that I've met through our network. And I know that's true of them as well. So it really just kind of becomes more of a family than anything else.
Yeah. When you describe the transition toward equity and climate justice, I'm assuming that means you've recruited into being engaged in the network a greater diversity of people, diversity in a variety of ways, and any number of metrics of diversity, which may have been a challenge given the sort of relative uniformity of the people who are originally involved as sort of environmental advocates with a certain kind of identity, a certain kind of culture, background. How is it? How do you manage to increase and create a welcoming space for a more diverse constituency membership?
Yeah, honestly, I think we have some work to do in that category. We're still a predominantly white network. We do have more people joining the network who are, people of color or are from organizations that really work in frontline communities. But I think we do have a lot of work to do to really still create that welcoming space. I think the best way that we do this, and this isn't necessarily in the context of racial diversity, but really just making sure that when a new person comes into the network, that we're getting them that network orientation right away. That's one of the most important indicators for their participation later on in the network is did they have an orientation, and was it a quality orientation? And then finding ways to just accelerate their engagement early on. So it's like, oh, you're working in Ohio. Cool. Actually, I'm going to get you connected with the folks in Ohio that I know, who I also know will be very responsive to help onboard some of your engagement. And then we just really try to the best of our ability to, again, we're always just centering equity into the work and into the conversation. And I think just the nature of that creates a more inclusive space than we've ever been able to do before.
Yeah. I have a question that echoes back to a conversation I had with Michelle just a couple of weeks ago. I asked her about co-work and whether she guides the network to conduct, work in small teams or work that's kind of coordinated and where different groups of people in different locations perform similar tasks. And her answer was not really. We don't really encourage that because we don't want to get in the business of telling people what to do. But rather we whatever their co-work is, or if they're spontaneously developing it, we support it. So it was kind of get a sort of a hands-off feel from her. How does that question resonate with you in REAMP? This question of, do you create opportunities for co-work for your membership?
I would say we do a little bit of both and. So there is, in some cases, there's a lot of intentionality behind the collaboration that we're encouraging. So through our state tables, for example, would be a great example of that. At the state level, that's where most of our members are working. And what we noticed was that there was a lot of competition at the state level. And what that caused was people not to be working together very well, right? Because they're fighting about money most of the time. The other thing that we uncovered was that what isn't funded in terms of climate work is the time it takes to build relationships and to do your best planning. Everybody wants to fund the work, right? The actions that you're going to take, right? That's the cool stuff, and you really get to celebrate it. But in order to do that stuff really well, you actually need really good relationships. You need really good strategies, and you only get good strategies by including a diversity of perspectives, and that's what's going to lead to the transformations we want to see. So in some cases, like our state tables, we're very explicit about saying, hey, this is about a state level collaborative infrastructure. We want you to just spend this money on coming together and having a meeting, on a regular basis, putting together pipelines for sharing information or resources between each other. If you need a coordinator, okay, we'll pay for that. So in that case, I feel like we're being a little bit more heavy-handed in terms of what we're expecting members to be doing. But we also have lots of opportunities for members to kind of percolate their own ideas. So at our annual meeting, for example, we always have small group strategy conversations. And members are the ones who are like coming up with those lists of ideas and conversations to have. We also have this other form of collaboration called an action team. So to the extent that members start to get energized around an idea, they can form an action team that they can then get some money, resources, and support from the network to really kind of bring people together, do their best planning, come up with a plan of action, and then we'll help them fund that. So we do a little bit of that. In terms of the business work of the network, we do that a lot through committees. And we are pretty intentional these days about recruiting people to committees. Again, I would say my own personal behavior in the past was like, who do I know and who do I like and who would be really easy to work with? Yeah, I'm gonna recruit all those people. And you know who you recruit then? All the people who look like you, pretty much. That doesn't really say much for the diversity of the network. It isn't really helping us bring together these diverse perspectives. So now we are much more intentional about really thinking about, who should we be recruiting? Maybe it's because they're on the edge. Maybe it's because, they're representing a particular constituency. Maybe it's because, of where they're geographically located. Maybe it's because of their expertise, whatever it is. We're a lot more intentional about, inviting people to step into those spaces than we ever have before. In some cases too, it's just sort of an open invitation, who in the network's interested in this. But in other times, we're a lot more strategic about that, especially around things like, planning for a big meeting like our annual meeting, or when our elections are up for our steering committee. That's another time where, it's an open call to the network, and then as staff, we've had conversations and we're encouraging certain people to run, because we're looking to really diversify our own board, because we think that's really important for us to really, again, continue to center equity on our work.
Yeah, I hear you. Tell me a little bit about assessment. You mentioned earlier that you have a kind of social mapping. You engage in social mapping, and you identify people at the periphery, or you might want to, find a way to connect more strongly. Do you have other ways of kind of assessing the system's health of the network, and then feeding back that information into your actions?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think this is an area too where we would really like to develop this in a lot greater capacity. For us right now, when we think about how healthy is our network? We do look at evaluations, and we ask a lot in almost every meeting that we have, how welcome did you feel in this meeting? So we're really kind of asking some questions about how people are feeling, like what their experience is, because that's a pretty strong indicator of, how we're doing in terms of the network's culture. We really pay attention to what new people are responding to in that way as well. We do this annual network survey, which I know sounds like a total snooze fest. You're like, oh, surveys, who cares? Everybody takes those. Our annual network survey is actually a really important function in our network, because it really does give us feedback that does improve the network. That change in our North Star goal only happened because for 3 years in a row, we saw that members were standing less squarely behind our goal. And then as we were like, well, that's interesting. Why is this happening? And we started digging into it. We found that it was because we had this disconnect between the idea of equitably decarbonizing the Midwest and then this 80% reduction by 2050. I was like, oh, we got to do something about this. We updated our North Star goal, and people are now 98, 99% behind the North Star goal now. We look at participation. Participation, I think, is always sort of a healthy indicator in how you're doing. And then, like you said, too, looking at those connections. So this is a relatively new area of work for us. Social systems mapping really didn't exist up until a few years ago. And it was only made possible because of a tool called SumApp. So SumApp so our social systems mapping work uses two platforms. We use Kumu, which I know a lot of people probably know. It's a platform that can take data and visualize it. But SumApp is this tool that collects information about people and your relationship between other people that can then be mapped in Kumu. And what's cool about SumApp is it's not only super easy to use, but it updates all of this stuff in real time. So you can see the changes in the network over time, and you can timestamp things. So what we have started to do is we push this out a lot around our annual meeting. So last year, what we did was we looked and said, hey, what was the difference in connections between 2018 annual meeting and 2019? We can see the number of connections. We can also see the density, because we rate that we sort of have a ranking of connections from like, oh, I've heard of this person, to, this is somebody who I intentionally partner with and we're mutually accountable. So we're able to start to measure this and see this and say, hey, okay, like, are we actually increasing relationships? Are we actually building trust in the network? Which again is the foundation for everything we do. It's 80% of the work that we do here in the network is focused on relationships. And it's honestly one of the hardest things to evaluate.
Yeah.
So I think we still have some work to do here, but those are some of the things that we pay attention to right now.
Cool. I have one last question before we go to breakouts, and then we'll have a bunch more questions when we get back. Which is, okay, we have a bunch of master students in a program that's informed by systems thinking, and they're involved in energy and food and policy and planning and urban development. If they wanted to take on the role of systems weaver, either in part or in whole, in their future career role, how would they prepare for that? Like, what would you recommend as a course of study or a skill set or an experience that would better equip you to take on a role of systems weaver?
That is a good question. And I have to admit, for myself, like I said, I had no idea what I was getting into when I started this job. Like, I was fresh out of college. I needed a job. I had done some work doing some canvassing and working for environmental organizations. And then this opportunity came up to work for the REAMP network and to do some organizing with clean energy businesses in Wisconsin through a member organization. And so that's how I just kind of landed the job. But like I said earlier, I think a lot of the same skill sets that's required of organizers lend themselves really well to being a network weaver, because again, it's not about you, it's about them, and that's really a practice that I really, wholeheartedly embrace. This job requires a lot of humility. I can't tell you how many times, especially because when you're a weaver, you're at the center, right? So you have a much different perspective than anybody else. I come up with some of the best ideas that get shot down all the time, and that's okay. Or I come up with something that I think is so brilliant and someone's like, well, actually, like, maybe we should do this or do that, and start tweaking things. So you really have to have a lot of humility, because you have to work in teams. So if you're going to be a network weaver, you're working with other people, you better be good at working and collaborating with others. Because if your tendency is that you want to work by yourself and not work with other people, this really isn't going to be the role for you. Because in a way too, you're kind of like a server. I before college, I did some service industry work, and I think a lot of those same skills, like helping the customer get what they want, making people happy, having fun with them, all of that builds that community from within. And by you knowing everyone else in the network, you're able to start facilitating those connections from between them. Right? Oh, you're doing this in North Dakota? Awesome. I know somebody in Michigan who's doing that. I'm going to connect the two of you so you guys can talk more about that. So kind of like serving as that channel of information, but then also not siloing yourself as that channel. Like, oh, here, let me tell you about the work that's happening in Michigan. That actually isn't a good network weaver practice, because I'm not building new connections in the network. So it's really important to do that. Yeah. So in terms of like, if I was going to school and studying things, it kind of depends on your role. I know somebody like Gail, she has a little bit different role in the network. She's still a network weaver, but she does a lot of the work to help members strategize. So having like that familiarity and understanding with, the energy system, policy, all that stuff, Gail's kind of an expert in that stuff. I am not. So it really does vary. If you were really interested in it, I would say try to find a way to get involved with a network. Find a way to volunteer or to intern with a network, and start to get some of that experience so that you can decide for yourself, like, what is the role that you would like to play in that, and what skills are you seeing that would be important for you to build if that's the direction you want to go. Yeah.
No, it sort of reminds me of a survey that I'm familiar with that was done of mid-career planners. They were asked what was the most important skill, the stuff they really wish they'd focused on when they were back in their master's programs in planning. And they all said it's not the technical skills, it's the people skills. It's the collaboration skills, the team building skills, the relationship management skills. those are the things that really were conditional upon the success that they had, especially once they rose up in the ranks. And I kind of hear resonance of that kind of perspective in what you're saying. It's people skills.
Yeah, people skills. And I see Mackenzie dropped in a comment. She's like, but wait, like service industry, that's very transactional. Like, how does that translate? And I think the way it translates is you want people to come back, right? Like, are you going to go to the restaurant where like you had a really terrible server and you did not have a good experience, like the food was bad or whatever? No. But if like, even if the food was bad, but your server was really great, you might go back again, or you might remember that. And so it's like, that's like that first point of contact, right? It's so important. First impressions really matter. So having good people skills as a network weaver is important, because people have to have a great experience, especially early on, so that they'll stay engaged, keep getting connected, stay involved in the work.
Definitely. Well, so cool. I think this is a good time to drop folks into small breakout groups. And so for about 5 minutes or so. So talk over what you heard, what you learned, what resonated with you, and come back with one insight or one question. And as we did last time, we'll go through them, hear the questions all one after another. And Sarah, you can take notes or just log them in your head, and then I'll give you a chance to respond to whatever resonated with you. And also, if you have time, Sarah, I'll drop you into one of the groups so you can talk with some of these folks in a little more intimate setting. Sound good? All right, let's do it. I'm going to open the rooms, and I'll see you in about 5 minutes. Hey, Duncan. Do you need to be moved to a room? Oh, you're frozen. Sarah, are you still with us here? I think you're gone too. Good. I think everyone's in their room. Let me just check.